So I can't help you with the airplane, but CFR.org.
I get it.
Go to.
But I don't want to acknowledge you guys are spying on the intelligence agencies.
I just want. However, one might describe U.S.-Russian ties, they are not good. And looking backwards over the last quarter of a century, in some ways it's anticipating what history will grapple with. Was this inevitable? Was there something about the nature of America, America's definition of what world order consisted of, something about Russian political culture that essentially, despite the optimism 25 years ago when President Bush 41, my boss at the time, talked about a new world order, was it inevitable, or to some extent, does Western policy bear some of the responsibility for the current state of affairs? Obviously, high on the list of certain people would be NATO enlargement. Did we have to get to where we are, or could it have been avoided?
I think it's hard to say it could have been avoided, but it's more easily able to identify why it didn't happen. And it wasn't, in my view, because of the expansion of NATO. As you may remember, that was my primary responsibility on the floor of the Senate with Michael Haass. And the only time I had a real serious and elongated disagreement and debate with Pat Moynihan was on the expansion of NATO. And his argument was, it's vastly oversimplified, it was much more articulate than I'm about to state, but was that this is not the time to worry the new leadership in Russia that they're about to be surrounded and overtaken, et cetera. I don't see, I ask the reverse question all the time, is what happens if we didn't have NATO? Does anybody think if NATO did not exist, the expansion of NATO did not occur, that somehow the fact that a KGB thug ended up in control of that country would have been altered? I don't see any evidence to suggest that would be the case. As a matter of fact, I would argue that you would very much likely see more use of military power and force. And one of the things we talked about, and I'll not go on any further, is that as all these Eastern and Central European countries were quote, freed, they all had their own agenda, their own historical fears, their own concerns, and they're all engaging independently in activities and actions that could have been very destabilizing to the whole region. So part of what we did was to stabilize and give some assurance to each of those countries that they should yield toward what would be more considered to be a basic democratic instincts and policies than to go the route some of them were considering going. In 2018, what was the consensus in America about what Russia was going to look like in 2030? Well, you know, I wouldn't want to have to be in a position, I often say to classes I teach, I would not want to be in a position, no matter what approach I took, of having to lead Russia. Look at the state of Russia now. They're in enormous decline. They're, by any definition, these guys are on a toboggan run. The question is when the run ends. You know, they have a second-rate military power. They have significant advantages geographically where they're engaged. They have a nuclear arsenal that can blow up the whole world. But in terms of their efficacy, their capacity is de minimis compared to ours. They're in a situation where they're an oil-based economy. You have Gazprom going from a market value of something like $350 billion to $50 billion in the last 10 years. Look, folks, we can't make this about a conflict between Russia and the United States. We got to make this about a conflict between the Russian kleptocracy and oligarchy and the Russian people. There is no country in the world that, in fact, is comfortable with wholesale corruption. Wholesale corruption. Not based on any ideological rationale why the concentration of wealth has occurred the way it has. And the fact of the matter is that I think that there's a lot of things we can do and should be doing to make it clear that Russia has violated these norms and still be willing on strategic matters to talk to them and cooperate with them.
Would one of them be, for example, publishing what we think is Putin's net worth?
Yes, we had an argument inside the outfit I used to work with about that. I'm all for publishing, especially when I had no money. I hadn't, when I did my financial disclosure as vice president, the headline in the paper was, "It's probable no man has ever assumed the office of vice president with fewer assets than Joe Biden." I assume they weren't speaking intellectual assets. But look, all kidding aside, I think to expose the truth, and we should be the friends of what is left of and the underground portion of civil society in Russia. We should not be silent. And part of that is laying out in stark relief what Russia is doing, how they have turned corruption into a foreign policy tool and a weapon. It's being used extremely well in Western Europe and other parts of the world. And I think it's a matter of us speaking up and speaking the truth. We don't have to make any of this up.